And I think we are live. Perfect. And I can't see how many people have joined yet, but I reckon it's a few. Perfect. Great. Let's wait 1 or 2 minutes before we dive in. But if you want, you can already post where you're joining from today. It's always very interesting to see where people are sitting that have joined today. Sweden, UK, Frankfurt, Germany. Hi, Verena. More Sweden, more Germany, UK. Super exciting. Finland as well. Fantastic. And France. Hi there. So many countries. So nice to see all of you. Perfect. So 2:02, I think it's a great time to start. Now, a quick introduction. My name is John. I'm an account executive and product specialist here at Eletive. Been with the company for a bit over 3.5 years. And over those 3.5 years, I've had the pleasure to talk to hundreds of companies and discuss how can we foster a culture of self-leadership and what are the tools we can actually put in place to make that happen in a successful and long-term sustainable way. So I'm super excited to speak about the topic of how a culture of self-leadership rewires your organization. Now, to hop in, a quick agenda, what I'm going to be discussing today. First, we're going to dive into what actually is self-leadership, then some theoretical foundations around self-leadership, but also related concepts. And then we have a couple of models and frameworks, followed by a real-life example, my own passion, climbing. And then self-leadership in an organizational context with the use case of employee engagements. I'm going to close with a couple of key takeaways, but then also open for some questions and an open discussion around the topic of self-leadership and how we actually implement it successfully. So to begin with, what actually is self-leadership? What do we mean when we say that term? So I brought a short quote, which is, at its core, self-leadership is about taking responsibility and ownership of one's own actions, thoughts, and emotions. It involves setting goals, making decisions, and taking initiative, all with the aim of achieving personal and professional success. And really important, it is about empowering oneself to be the best version of oneself, while also collaborating and supporting others in achieving their goals. In other words, it's not about being a lone wolf, but it's also about collaborating and bringing your best version every day to work, to sports, to education, and a variety of other contexts. A couple of the key theories that are underlying the concept of self-leadership is the self-leadership theory in itself, which was first coined by Muntz in 1986. And that basically means individuals can lead themselves through self-influence strategies, which increases motivation, autonomy, and performance. In other words, how individuals influence their own behavior. Another one that is very related is the social cognitive theory, which says human behavior is shaped by self-efficacy and self-regulation. And we're going to come back to that a bit later as well. So that essentially means how beliefs and the environment shape behavior. And in this case, it is how individuals influence the environment, how the environment influences the individuals, and how they then influence behavior together. And the third one I want to talk about today is the self-determination theory, or SDT, which at its core says humans perform best when 3 basic psychological needs are being satisfied, which is autonomy, competence, and relatedness. In other words, why intrinsic motivation drives performance. And into this one, we're also going to take a deep dive a bit later. Now, when it comes to the models, like how do we actually apply these things? I want to start with the self-leadership theory, where we have different tools that we can use. The main ones are personal goal setting, self-monitoring, habit tracking, and self-reward systems. Now, we're going to talk about the organizational context a bit later, but this is very applicable to a variety of different contexts, as I just mentioned: sports, education, organizational context, personal life. So many different use cases we can apply this to. Now, in an organizational application, the common ones are OKRs, so the objectives and key results, setting SMART goals, SMART standing, in this case, in case somebody doesn't know, for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And then having reflective performance reviews and personal accountability routines. And here, of course, it depends very much on the culture that you already have and how we then implement a strategy to foster these things and use these tools to make sure that over a long term, we also have a successful strategy in place. Now, another model that is related to this comes from the book, The Fifth Discipline, which is by Peter Sang, written around a continuous learning organization. So how do we actually achieve that? And one of the 5 disciplines is the personal mastery. Now, personal mastery in his model has 3 different components that are a continuous cycle. So let's start with a quote: "The discipline of continually clarifying and deepening our personal vision while focusing on our energies, developing patience, and seeing reality objectively." So if we apply that to the model of a personal vision, in other words, where do I actually want to go? What is my overarching polar star? Which is then sort of tested in the creative tension, which basically says, where am I today? And what's my personal vision? And where is the gap that I need to fill? In other words, how do I actually get there? And then the commitment to truth, which basically takes us back to earth and makes us look at reality clearly and not putting ourselves in a situation where we interpret data and the situation in a different way, which seems to be more comfortable because it's nicer if we feel like, yeah, we're already here. But actually, we need to look at what is actually happening today when we have, for example, collected data, or also when we have collected feedback in a personal manner. And of course, a lot of other things that we can measure as well. And the next one is the self-determination theory. Now, I've mentioned it before. That's one of the key theories that is related to also self-leadership principles. And we have the 3 psychological needs, which is autonomy, which essentially says the feeling in control of one's actions, behaviors, and choices, acting willingly. That'll be important on my next slide. Competence, which is the experience of mastery, effectiveness, and skill development in activities. And relatedness, one of my favorite ones, feeling connected, cared for, and to have a sense of belonging with others. Now, in practice and also in an organizational context, this basically means that autonomy is not no structure, you go and do whatever you want. It should, of course, also be within a certain framework. But it means giving choices and opportunities, allowing people to really take ownership and creating this shared ownership where everybody becomes part of the processes and also contributes in their own way. For competence, it of course means different things depending on the context that we look at. I assume that most of you work in people and culture or HR. So of course we have a lot of different tools here where we create continuous learning opportunities, give constructive feedback, which can also be done in the teams and should in most cases also be done in the teams that work day to day together. And also skill development programs where we have, for example, an LMS that is tailored to our organization or the different roles that we have in our company. One that I also really like is a stretch assignment. In other words, giving an employee or a manager a task that is just outside their comfort zone, allowing them to grow by putting it into practice and learning by doing. And also setting clear expectations. In other words, what is expected of you and what can you contribute? Where do you have to develop? How can we help you actually get there and develop this competence or skill necessary? And then relatedness, where we have the psychological safety, collaboration, strong team identity. We heard some of these topics were touched on in previous talks today as well, around hybrid work. How do we actually continuously build this strong team identity, even if we sit remotely or in a lot of different locations? And that also plays into building an inclusive culture where everybody actually feels valued as being part of that team, which we can also foster with recognition and appreciation processes that are in place. Now, all of these things play into one of my favorite subjects in the world. And those who have met me or know me will know that I'm a very passionate climber. I spend most of my weekends out climbing, and almost no vacation where I don't ask first, can we climb there? So let's take that as an example and put these frameworks into practice. Now, for those who don't know, in climbing, there's a lot of different disciplines. So you can go climbing without a rope in bouldering, or the very famous right now free solo, which I don't recommend. And then a very typical one is climbing with a rope, where either you can have a top rope, where as you see on the left side, the rope is already fixed, or you can lead climb. When it comes to sport climbing, usually the bolts are already there. Now, in top rope, there the risk is fairly low, as you're always connected and there can always be tension on the rope from your belayer. However, I want to focus on the lead climbing today, which essentially means as you go, you clip, you climb a little bit, you clip, you climb a little bit, you clip, which means you continuously put yourself into a higher risk zone where, depending on the difference, like the distance between the bolts, you might have a higher fall. So how the hell do we actually connect that to self-leadership and the frameworks I just explained? If we take a first look at the personal mastery, we want to have a vision. Where do I actually want to go? Which isn't exactly a goal. As we mentioned earlier, it's a continuous process. So it's not so much about the final outcome and way more about the actual journey. So the creative tension is then where you come in and you actually have to figure out a way. How do I get there? What's the next hold? Was this a good movement? Am I actually balancing my body right in this specific moment? And here you also have a commitment to truth. You cannot lie to yourself, because otherwise you increase the risk of falling and potentially injuring yourself. In this picture, that's my very first outdoor climbing experience. Ingo, my friend from university, is leading the pitch. So he is in this particular pitch taking the higher risk. But of course, he's also only able to do this because he has all the other psychological needs met that we just saw in the self-determination theory, which is the second part that I have in the slide. So what does that mean? It means that he has the autonomy to take his own decisions. Nobody's going to tell him exactly which hold to take and where to move his foot. That's his own choice, and he's acting willingly. He's willingly putting himself into this sort of risky situation. And he needs to believe in his own competence to actually do this move, take this decision, trust the gear, all of these things. But at the same time, we also need the relatedness and feeling connected to others, not just through a rope, but through a system of the carabiners, the harness, the shoes, the rock, the person belaying you, so many different things that contribute to this super crucial factor. If we apply this to an organizational context, you could say that if you give an employee a stretch assignment that is just outside their comfort zone, they are taking a risk that maybe the performance is not going to be so good. But they need to trust that if they fail, the manager, the colleagues or the organization as a whole is going to catch them. And one thing that I've learned in climbing as well is that the best outcome usually comes not when you say, you got this, put your foot there, put your foot here, but actually when you just say, I've got you, which also gives them the feeling of, you can take the risk, you can take the decisions that you need to take in your situation, and if you fall, I will catch you. I see a lot of reactions, so I see that you agree with me that that's a great analogy. Now, let's take this and actually apply it to an organizational context, where we talk about how do you actually then build a culture of self-leadership in your organization. Now, there's a lot of different applications that we can use. We've touched on a few. We can have a learning management system. We can give autonomy in certain parts of work processes. We can test out new things. There's also, for example, the continuous improvement process that was coined by Japan in the factories, where you continuously look for improvements. Opening these things to employees can be super valuable. Might it be in a production company, in a hospitality organization, or any other organization where you have processes that are customer related or internal related. This is applicable to basically any case. As we also mentioned, of course, in a certain framework, not everybody should just go out and do whatever they want or constantly try to look for improvements. But it is very crucial that the people feel like they can bring up things, they can try out new things. And if it's not a good idea, we will catch you anyways, but it's an open culture. One use case that, of course, we are specialized in as an organization, which is why I feel most confident talking about this one, are feedback processes, especially related to employee engagement, where we can use a variety of different things like employee surveys. We can have ad hoc surveys. We can also use comments, and people can use feedback as well. And then we have performance management. As we also touched upon, we want to have a toolkit of different things like OKRs, which allows us to set smart goals. So we can also understand and track our process ourselves as an organization, but then also throughout all the different hierarchies. And then have one-on-one templates, where we have, for example, feedback between managers and employees, and then 360 surveys, where the self-leadership is applicable mostly to managers, to give them an understanding and be committed to truth. Where do I actually stand, and not and make that data-driven, so they don't have basically an opportunity to fool themselves in certain areas. Now, when it comes to these processes in practice, we have a variety of different options that we can use. And in Eletive, of course, we are built around the concept of self-leadership. So we want to have interaction, we want to have participation, while at the same time also allowing flexibility to meet your particular organizational culture, which means we don't need to use all of the features at once, but rather take a look at, do you have any challenges or maybe a hypothesis you want to test, and then what kind of features would we actually need to achieve that. Now, that's a topic that Müller, if you watched the talk earlier, the keynote together with Chiara and me, they also mentioned that giving the employees access and the managers access to take ownership of their own results and actions afterwards has been a crucial turning point for them, which also led to a participation rate of 94% in a multinational enterprise organization. So giving opportunities, giving transparency where applicable is super powerful when it comes to engagement and how we actually put this into practice, instead of the feedback ending in a black box and the employees not hearing back from it. And then, of course, interaction when it comes to anonymous chats, and then also action planning, which means using OKRs, using one-on-ones, and allowing a lot of different opportunities on all different levels in the organization. Now, when it comes to the outcome, what kind of impact does a culture of self-leadership then actually have on your organization? We see that we have, and this was done from a study where they compared 4 decades of literature around self-leadership. They saw that in these things that are listed here, we have a positive correlation between a culture of self-leadership, which can also be like reflected in these different concepts that we just talked about, the different models and theories behind it. They have positive impact on creativity and innovation and self-efficacy, which essentially means that you trust yourself that you can complete a certain task. On external leadership, which in this case doesn't mean the self-leadership, but also for managers, or also, for example, with customers, or if you're a consultant and so on. On ethics in your organization and good behavior, as well as psychological empowerment and job satisfaction, reduce stress and anxiety, emotional regulation goes up, career success goes up, and team performance as well. And that's also why I didn't focus on the performance part too much today, because it looks so different for each organization that I've talked to over the years. And we really have to understand what do we need to do to positively impact performance and these other parts. And as you can see, when we talk about engagement, I didn't include it on this slide because there are a couple of points like psychological empowerment, job satisfaction, reduced stress and anxiety, emotional regulation, career success, creativity, innovation, like basically all of those also contribute to a higher engagement index, however you might measure it. So those are some of the outcomes that a culture of self-leadership has. And as I just mentioned, there's a couple of different ways how we can actually implement this. From my experience, it is best not done in isolation, but together with the managers and the employees to also understand how do people actually adopt these new processes and what kind of potential is in the workforce that we potentially don't utilize in the maximum way yet. And that also leads me to the key takeaway, which is what are the 3 things that I want you to take away from today that self-leadership can actually contribute to. The first one is from the self-leadership theory, which is rewiring leadership. So leadership as a role goes to leadership as a capability. And if you listened to the keynote on hybrid work a bit earlier, that's a part of what she was talking about, where leadership is now distributed across the entire organization, where everybody contributes to taking the next step, to leading themselves and influencing others to also achieve their goals. The next one is rewiring performance, which is from the social cognitive theory, where we go from having fixed views of capability to self-efficacy, which allows us to also take those risks, try new things, continuously learn, and put these things into practice. And the last one I wanted to take away from today is rewiring motivation, which is from the self-determination theory, where we go from external control, more like a top-down kind of leadership style, to intrinsic motivation. And I hope that some of the things actually made sense also when it comes to the climbing example of how do we actually get to the intrinsic motivation. And with that, we have 5 minutes left. Thank you so much for listening. And here's one final climbing picture from me climbing over New Year's in Cyprus. If you want to get in touch, here's my contact details. Do hit me on LinkedIn. And we have 5 more minutes for questions that I will happily answer. Let's take a look at the Q&A. So Margareta Persson is asking, how can leaders encourage autonomy without losing alignment? let me think about this for a second. I think the key parts that I have seen when it comes to giving autonomy is to also make sure that whatever the topic might be or the project might be, we somehow make it measurable, where the SMART goals are a super good way to actually put this into practice. So give the autonomy and give the ownership, but at the same time also make sure that it is tracked somehow, so that we have the ownership, the responsibility, but then also accountability for whatever the outcome might be. And as I just mentioned, it is super crucial then to also show that whatever happens, we will catch you if you fail. As long as you give it your best, everything is possible. Let's see. If you have questions, do feel free to put it into the Q&A and not in the chat, so that we can also put it on stage. Let's see.
Questions?
Thanks for the feedback, Robert. And you can take a second if you think about a question. I'll give you some time to also write it, and we can put it up on stage. And otherwise, of course, I'm also super happy to connect later and take questions in a separate meeting, or you can add me on LinkedIn and ask me to ask as well, of course. Margarete again is asking, what are the biggest cultural shifts needed to make self-leadership work? We've heard this answer before in an earlier session today, and I have to give it again. It very much depends. It depends on the organizational structure. It depends on the organizational culture that you have built. And I would say that if you have a very transparent organization already, if people already have a lot of autonomy, it's not going to be as big of a shift. While at the same time, if you have a more traditional hierarchy in the organization, where people usually don't come with a lot of input, then it's a bit more of a challenge. But at the same time, also a great opportunity, because that means that most likely there's a lot of untapped potential that we can actually go into. And when we allow people to then come with ideas, come with projects, and give ownership, usually we also see that the retention rate and the performance and overall job satisfaction and empowerment go up as well. So I would say that's probably the biggest part, is just to have a good structure for this and understand that it is a cultural difference, and then also take the self-leadership into practice yourself and learn as you go. Perfect. And I see that, Tamara, you liked the climbing analogy. I am very happy to hear that. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, you will see some climbing pictures as well. But perfect. So thank you so much for the session. It was a pleasure talking about one of my favorite topics in the world, self-leadership, together with climbing. I hope you all have a great day. And until then, take care. Bye-bye.